So as Gareth said, we are getting towards the end of Paul's letter to the Philippians, and in the first 3 chapters, Paul has covered a lot of ground. He's given them lots of teaching on all sorts of different things. And then we get to the start of chapter 4, and he says, therefore, meaning in light of everything that he's already written so far, keeping all of what we've explored together in chapters 1 to 3, keeping all of that in mind, here's one more thing that he wants them to do. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, you whom I love and long for, my joy and crown. Once again, he's underlining his relationship to this church in Philippi, his love and his care for them. And he urges them, stand firm in the Lord in this way, dear friends. Stand firm in the Lord. That phrase, stand firm, has already appeared in this letter, and it points us all the way back to chapter 1, to the main thesis, the central point of this letter, the point that Paul really wants to drive home to the Philippians. You may remember us saying right at the beginning of the series, this letter is written according to a well-known pattern of Greco-Roman rhetoric. And if you kind of look at it through the lens of that pattern, you find the main thesis in Philippians 1, verse 27. Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of the King. Or you could equally translate that, live as citizens of the gospel of the King. Then, whether I come to see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel. So that's Paul's central concern in this letter, that they would live as citizens of the gospel of King Jesus and that they would stand firm in doing so. And that's what he brings back to them here in chapter 4. Standing firm, as you might imagine, is a kind of most often used in a military context. You can sort of picture the soldiers of the Roman army, for example, standing shoulder to shoulder and holding their ground side by side in battle. But that leaves us with a question, and the Philippians with a question. Well, what does it actually mean? What does it look like for them and for us to stand firm in daily life? And so the rest of the letter, the rest of chapter 4, really gives a whole series of short snapshots to kind of show them what standing firm might look like for them in their everyday lives. We heard in verse 4, it looks like rejoicing. Rejoicing in what? Well, in the Lord. You and I can't always necessarily rejoice in our circumstances, but we can always rejoice in the Lord, in what Jesus has done. In verse 5, it looks like our gentleness being evident to those around us. It looks like other people being able to see that we really, genuinely care. In verse 6, it looks like not being anxious for anything. I would actually tie that one in with the rejoicing. If we're rejoicing in the Lord and focused on Jesus, then we're going to be trusting in God to make a way where things are tough. But the more we focus on ourselves and on our situations, then the more prone we'll be to anxiety. And so he goes on through the rest of chapter 4, giving all these little examples of what standing firm might mean for them and for us. We're going to just zoom in this morning on the first example, which Paul gives in verses 2 and 3. You might want to have those verses in front of you. So verse 2, I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. There are two people in the church, they happen to both be women in this case, who are at odds with each other. It's a scenario that we will be familiar with, I'm sure. We don't know the nature of their disagreement in this case, but it seems that these two women were leaders in the church, and that the disagreement between them is causing some sort of friction in the church as a whole. It is not just between the two of them, it's having an impact on the Philippian church. And so Paul addresses the conflict by calling these two women out in front of the church. Remember, this letter would have been read out loud to a gathering of the whole church. And so as they were sitting listening to this, chances are Euodia and Syntyche were sitting in the room listening to this letter when it gets to this point, and suddenly they hear their names and they hear Paul's words. Hey, Euodia. Hey, Syntyche. You two need to sort things out. And Paul says, I'm calling you to be of the same mind, to be intent on the same goal. It doesn't mean that they have to agree on everything. Unity is not the same thing as uniformity. They may disagree on how they're going to go about things or how they're going to get there, but they need to be intent on the same goal. And this goal is in the Lord. This is all about the Lord Jesus and his gospel, the announcement of his rule and reign as king over all. And that means that whatever this conflict is about, whatever our conflicts might be about, it's not about what's best for me or what's best for you. It's always about what's best for the gospel. And so he goes on, verse 3. Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, to help these women. Paul also in this letter calls in a third party. We might label them or designate them as a mediator. He knows that at times we need help to get along. Anyone who has supervised more than one child at a time will know that all too well. Now, the identity of my true companion is a bit of a mystery. Scholars have kind of come up with endless theories, it seems, but most likely it could be Timothy or Epaphroditus. But either way, it doesn't really matter who the person is. Paul wants this companion to help these women because they have contended at his side in the cause of the gospel. What that means is these are not bad women. Euodia and Syntyche are not bad people. They are leaders in the church. They've contended for the gospel at Paul's side. They're not troublemakers. And what that means as we kind of listen to this morning is that it doesn't matter how godly we are. It doesn't matter how much leadership responsibility we carry. It doesn't matter how amazing our life group is or how godly our church might be. We will have conflict in our relationships too. The question is not if we will have conflict, but more like when we will have conflict. How will we handle that? He underlines it further. He says, these women whose names are in the book of life. The book of life was a metaphor used in the scriptures for the people of God. If your name was written in the book of life, then you were counted part of the people of God. Meaning that on the day of resurrection, you will stand before God as his son or his daughter. And it's almost like Paul is saying in this bit that, look, Euodia and Syntyche, your names are both in the book of life. You are going to live together forever in the resurrection, so you might as well get things sorted out now. So let's notice what Paul is doing here. Notice, firstly, that Paul is calling Euodia and Syntyche and the church to deal with the problem and not to run from it. Human tendency when things are difficult or where there's conflict is to run. When we get into conflict in a friendship, I've seen this happen numerous times. The natural instinct is to ditch the friend we've fallen out with and go and make a new one. Go and find someone else to hang out with. Just avoid the person that you now find difficult. You fall out with your life group. Human tendency is to drop out. Maybe join another one, maybe not. You don't like your church? Don't worry, there's countless amazing churches all over the city. Go and find another one. And in that vein, people move from one relationship to another, from one group to another, one church to another, one job to another. All because we don't know how to handle conflict, how to love, how to really forgive, how to work things out. And that's what Paul is wanting to get at for these two ladies in the Philippian church. Now notice what Paul does not do, first of all. He doesn't take sides. He's pleading with Euodia and he's pleading with Syntyche. He's very careful to use exactly the same phrase both times. Paul is smart enough to know that whatever he's heard about this conflict, there are two sides to every story. And we need to keep that in mind as well. When someone is bad-mouthing their friend or their husband or their wife or their pastor or their boss, just always be thinking in the back of our minds, I wonder what the other side of this story is. I wonder if I was having this conversation with the husband or the boss, what they would be saying to me. I wonder what it is that this person is not telling me in their version of events. Paul ultimately doesn't take sides here because he's not on Euodia's side and he's not on Syntyche's side. Where he wants to be is on Jesus' side. He's also not saying to them that they're not justified in arguing with each other. There's no hint here that that their conflict wasn't real or that it didn't matter or that there wasn't an issue to be resolved. He's not asking them to pretend that it's not a big deal. He's also not trying to say, I don't think, that they have to be best friends and hang out all the time. What he's saying is they need to be of the same mind. They need to be intent on the same goal in the Lord. And therefore to do what is best for God's church, for the good news of Jesus. And then on the flip side, let's notice what Paul is doing here. Firstly, he does deal with the issue. Paul is not ignoring it. He's not pretending that it's not happening. He's not kind of glossing over it in a vague sort of way. He's not thinking to himself, I'll deal with it in my next letter. If I'm honest, that would always be my tendency. I'll deal with it in the next conversation, in my next letter. No, Paul deals with the issue and he calls these two women out. Not in a kind of passive-aggressive way. I was praying the other day and I felt in my spirit that there were two people who might have an issue that needed to be sorted out. If you could only kind of just work it out for me. But he doesn't do it that way. He does it very simply and very directly. Euodia, Syntyche, get your act together and sort things out. Everybody, help these two women to do that, will you? That's his approach. He does deal with the issue simply and directly. Secondly, he does call the whole church to help the women work things out, meaning that there is a sense in which we all have a responsibility to work and to pray for unity in the church. We need to be careful here because, even if we're not involved in the conflict, well, yes, we need to be sensitive. If it's just an issue between two people, then that's for them to kind of work it out. But if the conflict is affecting the wider church, then yes, to the extent that we are a family of brothers and sisters in the Lord, then we have a responsibility to help each other work things out. Now, in all of this, it's worth saying, Paul is assuming that they are operating and living as a real and true community. The kind of community where you know and you are known. The kind of community where people see through your facade and your Sunday best to all of your imperfections. The kind of community where people call you out on your stuff. And I would suggest that if people are not calling you out on your stuff, then chances are you're not in true community. Either that or you're perfect, but I know which is more likely. It's also not the same thing as having lots of friends and acquaintances. You can know hundreds of people. You can be the most extroverted, socializing person and not be in real community. It's too easy to substitute depth of relationship for lots of shallow relationships. If we're going to deal with conflict well, in the way that Paul is dealing with it here, then we need to be in real community. And then the other thing Paul does is he calls the women to see the issue and to come at things through the lens of the gospel. His real question is, what is best for the gospel? What is best for the kingdom of God? What is best for the life of this church family? Kind of get your eyes off yourself and onto the gospel. Not to look at this through the lens of your own happiness. Because the truth is that we find life not when we chase after happiness, but when we chase after Jesus. Jesus put it this way: whoever wants to save his life will lose it, and whoever gives away his life for the sake of the gospel will find it. And so the other assumption that I think Paul is making here is the assumption that this community is seeking as best as it can to be a living display of the gospel, a living display of this news that Jesus is King. His whole letter is about the gospel. Paul's not writing them a self-help book for relational conflicts. Yes, you need to get along and you need to work things out, but it's so that the world that is watching you will see the gospel. People around us are meant to look at us and how we live as citizens of the gospel and go, now I get it. Now I see why this is good news. One of our values here at St. Matthew's is the value of authenticity, which on the one hand is kind of saying, look, we recognize that we are all works in progress. We are all imperfect. None of us have arrived yet, just as Paul was saying a couple of weeks back. We haven't yet arrived at the end goal. But at the same time, we are trying to be real with one another in living this out and working it out in our daily lives. We want to be authentic in the way we show up to one another. The way it's meant to work in Paul's framework, I think, is that the way we love one another, the way we forgive when things go wrong, the way we serve each other's needs and bear each other's burdens. When other people see all of that, what they're meant to see is a living display of the gospel. And that's how it is meant to work. So with all of that in mind, some questions for us to ponder as we finish. Firstly, a question: is there a Euodia or a Syntyche in your life? Is there somebody that you are at odds with? Is there a relationship where you need to do some work in order to be of the same mind in the Lord? Somebody where you need to go and make things right, to ask for forgiveness? Is there somebody in your life you need to make things right with? Or it may be that there's a situation where you're the third party, the one true companion, as it were. And maybe your role is helping others to work things out. Maybe in your life group you're aware that there's a couple of people you could just do with helping to have some conversation, or a team that you're serving on. Second question: are you in real community? Are you meeting regularly with others in order to share life together? Are you living authentically with others? And that's what our life groups are meant to be for. Maybe the response for you this week is to seek to join one of those. And if you are in a life group already, maybe the question is this: are you authentically showing up, warts and all, to the other members of your group? And then finally, is your community a living display of the gospel? Again, I'm thinking primarily of those smaller groups that we belong to, our life groups here. Is your life group doing life together in such a way that others can look in and see the gospel on display? What steps might you need to take to move more in that direction? Let's just pause a moment to reflect on those things. Is there a Euodia or a Syntyche in your life? Are you in real community? And if so, is your community a living display of the gospel? Let's be still for a moment.